Good morning, Agent. As you well know, colleges and universities across the nation are trying to increase their enrollment. As a result, many college students are being placed in increasingly confined living spaces. Your own daughter has been caught up in this national crisis. To increase available space, she has been forced to elevate her dorm bed. Her school has failed to provide her a comfortable way to climb up in her bed. Beneath your planer, you will find a note card provided by your daughter with the plans to solve her current predicament. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to build the design outlined on that card and deliver it to her room. As always, should you or any of your fingers be lost on this mission, the secretary will disavow any knowledge. This message will self-destruct in 5 seconds. Just kidding, we don't have the budget for that.
Well, that was fun. And for the record, I do my own stunts. Also, the note card was real. This is something that my daughter gave me just a couple weeks ago after we sent her off to school. And it describes exactly what she's looking for in what I'm going to build this week. Might be hard to see here, but it's a set of steps that I've put into a model right here from pieces I cut using the laser cutter. It's going to be both a bookshelf and a set of steps leading up to her bed. The interesting thing about it is we had to keep in mind that we had to get it into her room in a reasonable way. And so I made it into a modular shape. I'm going to build each of these 3 pieces separately. And I think because of that, if you wanted to later, you could have it just be a bookshelf that runs across the side of a room. The model shows a few things, not just that it's modular, but if you look, each one of the horizontal pieces that are here that could be stepped on as part of the ladder has support on both of its sides, and if it's a longer one, in the middle. So we're not butting it up against a wall and trying to hold it there, but we're setting it on top, giving it that strength. The other thing it shows is there are these little tabs on them, and in some cases there are slots that they go into. In the end, they're not going to look exactly like this. These are actually going to be tenons that are hidden inside of some mortises. I'm going to make it so you don't see any screws or any attachments like that. It's going to be glued together. Now, of course, the easiest way to have done this would be just take a piece of plywood, replicate all of these things here, glue them together, and screw them together. But we don't want to do easy here, do we? We're going for mission impossible. So we're going to make it a little bit nicer, and we've got a few surprises along the way. Let's get to building it.
Every piece in this bookshelf is either just over 12 inches or just over 24 inches. And so I'm cutting those down from some rough cut maple that I purchased for this project. While I'm doing that, I think I should mention the importance of asking clarifying questions. You'll remember that my daughter gave me the design for this particular project on this note card. It very clearly states that each individual box inside of the bookshelf should be 13 inches tall and 12 inches wide, and the whole thing should be about 48 inches wide because there are 4 of those boxes. When asking her further questions about it though, it turns out she actually wanted to use something inside of the shelves that was already 12 inches wide. So she actually needs the inside dimensions to be 12 inches and not the outside, which is a pretty big change and would have been very difficult to manage after the shelves had already been built. I should also mention that I actually missed some of the detail that she put into this card, and that's going to catch up to us at the very end of the project. Once the pieces are all to length, the next step is to do the milling on the jointer and on the thickness planer. Since I do this on just about every project at the very beginning, rather than talk too much about it, I thought I might talk a little bit about the material choice. I mentioned at the beginning that using plywood would be a totally legitimate choice for this particular project. You could make the entire bookshelf out of about 1 sheet of plywood and some edge banding, so the cost to you would probably be around $50. If you were working on a budget, especially if you were a college student yourself making for your own dorm room, this is probably the smart choice. I instead am using hard maple. Why did I do that? Well, I like the look of hard maple. It allows me to do a few more things, and I enjoy woodworking. And I'm making these videos because I like woodworking, and I get to do a little more of that using this little bit more difficult material. Using hard maple will increase the cost to about $150 and probably add at least 2 days extra work to the project. You've probably noticed by now that despite all of this talking, I haven't yet gotten to the thickness planer. The jointer gave me a clean edge on one side, and I took it over to the table saw to get a clean edge on the other side as well. I did it in this order because the pieces that I'm gluing together are eventually going to be 12 inches wide, which means I can glue them all up and then still fit them through my thickness planer, which will allow me to get rid of any inconsistencies that happen during the glue up. Cutting them on the table saw ahead of time meant that I could take whatever their width is and choose which side I wanted to cut off to get it down to its final width. That is exactly what I'm doing here, taking each one of the boards that's now been planed down to the same thickness and getting them to the same width, 12 inches. I then move over to the miter saw where I clean up one end of each of the boards to fix the misalignment that happened during glue up. My translation of my daughter's note card looks something like this. It gives me the length of each of the pieces and lets me know which side has a tenon and which side I need to put a mortise. Using that information, I cut the pieces to their final length, and I use these two little tab marks with a pencil to indicate which sides needed a tenon. I cut those tenons by using a 1/4 inch dado and setting its height to 1/4 inch as well, and then cutting both sides, giving me a 1/4 inch tongue right down the middle. To complete the tenon, I then simply had to raise the blade up to about 1 inch in height and run the board back through, cutting out the two ends of the tongue, giving me that final tenon. My first thought on the mortise was that I could still use my dado blade, bring the height back down to just over 1/4 inch, and bring it 1/4 inch off of my fence. Unfortunately, the radius of the blade is just too much to be able to do a hidden tenon and still have enough room for it to bite. So I switched over instead to the classic method, which is just to get the router out. This cut is called a blind dado because you can't see it at either of the end, and you can cut this on a router table. I just decided to do it by hand. The important part is that the dado cut itself goes a little bit further than the tenons so that you don't have to worry about the rounded over ends. As a surprise to my daughter, I wanted to inject a little bit of school spirit into it, and so I used the laser cutter to cut out the logo of the school onto two of the sides of the steps. I mixed up some epoxy to go into those engraved spots, and I colored that using both a little bit of dye and a little bit of red mica powder. The final result was a little bit darker than I wanted it to be. I think that was probably because just of the darkened color that comes from the laser engraving, and I probably could have sanded that down a little to get rid of some of that darker color. But I think it still turned out well, and I thought she would appreciate it. As my kids have been growing up, I've had to think a little bit more about those lessons in life that you just have to learn. I think one of those lessons is that just about everything on social media is a lie. And really, woodworking videos are no exception. And the biggest place where you can see this is in sanding. I have struggled in all of my videos to convey just how much time is spent sanding the pieces that I make. So I thought this time I'd show you through a stop motion video. And keep in mind that this is one grit on about half of the boards. I sand each board and each side at 80, 120, 180, and 220 grits. These portions with epoxy, I go even higher than that. I take those all the way up to 500 grit so that the epoxy itself can have more of a polished look. To make carrying the pieces around a little safer, I wait till I get to the 220 grit and then I sand off the sharpness of the edges. In the end, I feel that if you love building things right enough to put up with the sanding, then you have what it takes to learn to be a woodworker. I decided to apply the finish to each of the pieces before assembling it, due mostly to the number of inside corners I was going to have to deal with. The finish that I'm using here is a hard wax oil by Osmo called Poly-X. This is their clear glossy version of that finish. Starting with the largest part of the bookshelf, I made sure to dry fit all of the pieces together before actually putting glue on them and doing the final assembly. This time lapse shows how all of the assembly went together, and there are a few important things to notice. One is that I use these guides to make sure that everything is coming in square as I glue it together. Another is that sometimes I use clamps for alignment and not just pressure on the glue. And the last thing you might notice is that you don't have to use glue everywhere. Where I have two joints, I didn't use a mortise and tenon on both sides. I actually just screwed in one through the mortises that I had cut. The unintended side effect of using screws to attach that bottom piece was that a couple of the screws ended up protruding further than I thought, and I ended up having to take little notches out of the tenons. I marked where those screws were, and then I used an oscillating multi-tool to take out the tenon pieces so that they would avoid the protruding heads of the screws. I was a little more careful with my countersinking on the two L-shaped bookshelves, so this didn't end up being a problem in the future assemblies. The L-shaped shelves are assembled much the same way the box-shaped one was. Like the box-shaped assembly, I did it in two parts. First, I glued everything up to the point where I was screwing in the vertical middle wall. I then let all of that dry. And I finished it up with the accent wall and the top step.
Alright, so everything's assembled and it was pre-finished, so the work is mostly done. There were two things that I needed to keep in mind that I knew even from the start I'd have to look at. The first is that construction like this can have the potential to have some racking to it. So the compression strength, the strength straight down, we're totally fine with. But construction like this can sometimes have that domino effect where it can tip over. Now it turns out these joints, I was questioning this, but these joints are actually very strong with the mortise and tenon in them, and when I push on it, I can't get any give out of it at all. So I'm actually not going to worry about that. If you were to make these out of plywood and use butt joints with screws, things like that, you probably would want to worry about that. There's a couple ways to fix that. You can make these little diamond-shaped plates, stick them on there and just screw them in. Obviously then from the front you would be able to see these in the back. If you don't like that, they make, at the box stores you can pick these up, simple T-plates where you could stick them into the corners, screw those in, and you wouldn't see them. Now the other thing that I do need to worry about is it's slipping. Now if you're walking up and down this is just sitting on top of the other one. It's got that finished surface, it's slippery. You don't want that slipping out. So what I am going to do is use these mending plates, and I'm going to stick them in the places where the two come together, both here horizontally and on the vertical side. It comes with screws. I don't want to do it that way. I want it to be reconfigurable. So what I'm going to do instead is take some of these rivet nuts. I'm going to install those in and then use machine screws to attach them so that you can take it out with a simple screwdriver, but it'll be plenty strong when it's sitting there and invisible. So I'm going to finish that work up. I need to get that done because I'm scheduled to deliver it to my daughter tomorrow. Hopefully I'll get a couple of pictures there as well, and we'll be all done with this, and hopefully she can enjoy it for the rest of her college career.
And as is all too usual with my plans, that one lasted all of 5 minutes after I recorded it. The metal brackets in the back still had quite a bit of contrast to the wood color and weren't quite as invisible as I had hoped. So I decided to make some of my own brackets, this time out of some spare maple that had been left over from the project. These brackets will clearly not be as strong as the metal, but they'll do the job for keeping any of that horizontal push that comes as someone walks up the stairs from dislocating the shelves. Earlier in the video, I was mentioning how important it is to ask follow-up questions. And you'll recall I mentioned that I perhaps made a mistake in doing that. Well, you're watching me put these brackets on the wrong side. The note card that my daughter gave me had a backside. It looked like this. I had assumed that she wanted these staircases up against the wall perpendicular to her bed, but she actually wanted it parallel to her bed. I didn't figure that out until I got there and delivered them. So it's a good thing I went with brackets that matched a little bit better. She said they were okay that way. I think she's pretty happy with the results, and that makes me happy too. Thank you for watching this build. We'll be back with the next one to build something new, and I hope to see you there too.